Hi, welcome to Exploring Religion. I'm Dr. Kegan Chandler, and in this episode, we're going to continue our search for Shinto in Japan's ancient past, beginning with an exploration of a few different historical periods. First, the late Jomon era, very roughly 1000 BCE to about 300 BCE, and then the Yayoi period, which is usually described as lasting from around 300 BCE to 300 CE. And we'll also be talking about the Kofun era, which lasts from around 300 to 538 CE. So, all in all, a period of about 1500 years or so, beginning from the year 1000. And as we will discover, it is in the earliest of these eras, the Jomon period, that we will discover artifacts which can arguably be associated with what we will later describe as Shinto. The Jomon culture actually gets its name from a feature observed in this culture's style of pottery. Jomon means rope pattern or straw rope pattern. And if you're watching our video, you'll see here an example of an artifact from this culture. This is a dogu or an earthenware clay figurine associated with the Jomon culture. Very unique, very striking proportions and decorative imprints here. Quite interesting to look at. And you'll also see beside it a dotaku or a bronze bell hammered from a rather thin bronze. And this is an example of an artifact from the Yayoi period, which immediately follows the Jomon era. And the Yayoi period actually gets its name from the area in modern Tokyo where this later culture's artifacts were first discovered. And from the remains recovered at late Jomon and Yayoi sites, we know that in general, the ancient peoples of Japan were proficient in metalworking and also that they were skilled rice farmers utilizing a productive style of wet rice cultivation. And this style of farming probably emerged at the end of the late Jomon period. And furthermore, ancient Japanese, especially in the final part of the Jomon and in the Yayoi periods, they also produced mirrors and other bronze items. And most famously, or perhaps most importantly for this episode, they produced items which are called Magatama. Magatama are carved jewels or carved stones, which are in the shape of kamas and are often made out of jade. On the screen, I've put several examples from the Jomon period on the left, and also some examples from the later Kofun period, which followed the Yayoi and again lasted from around 300 to about 538 CE, or maybe closer to 600 according to some. And the Kofun era is most famous for its burial mounds, which we'll get to shortly, which feature a heavy association with Magatama. But it is these strange comma shaped jewels or stones which will form our gateway to talking about religion in the most ancient periods of Japan. Fans of Japanese video games, manga, or anime will likely already be familiar with Magatama. These objects are encountered in many Japanese stories where they are almost always treated as ancient and mystical talismans of power. And on the screen, I have a few examples here. On the left, you'll see a few blue colored jewels carried by some fierce looking characters. This is from the anime adaptation of the manga Blue Seed. Next, there's a screenshot from the live action kaiju film Gamera Guardian of the Universe. And if I remember correctly, in the film, they say that these are artifacts from Atlantis, but I might be misremembering that. And on the right, you'll see the necklace being worn by this character has a Magatama. This is the character Maya Fey from the Ace Attorney series of video games. So these things show up all over in Japanese media. Now, as I mentioned, these Magatama or these jewels or beads actually trace back to, well, not Atlantis, but to what we call the final Jomon period, which again lasted from around 1000 BCE to 300 BCE. And interestingly, the Magatama from this ancient era don't look like the beautiful mystical jewels that we see in anime and video games, and which can be found among later periods like the Kofun. These Jomon Magatama are more crude. They are made from elements like quartz, but also from clay or slate. And these are popularly known as Stone Age Magatama. And I'll put these older examples back on the screen here. Now, what exactly these objects are supposed to resemble has been a subject of scholarly discussion for many years. Some scholars imagine that these comma shaped beads were objects originally designed to resemble the teeth of large predators. Others have proposed that they resemble the shape of human fetuses. Others have suggested they resemble the moon, or perhaps more abstractly, the shape of the human soul. Very interesting. Now, regardless, by the end of the Jomon era and leading into the Yayoi around 300 BCE, these objects seem to have taken up a ceremonial significance in addition to being symbols, perhaps, of wealth or status. But the specific religious beliefs connected to these jewels, uh, it's not clear. Guesses have included the idea that the Magatama were possibly associated with fertility. I do tend to scratch my head at this. It seems to me that when scholars can't figure out what something is for, a good default guess is fertility. And that might be right. But anyway, I think it is important that some of the Yayoi Magatama have been found in association with burial sites. And perhaps a good guess is that people may have worn these jewels as amulets for spiritual protection or power. It's clear that they were worn since each of these comma shaped jewels have a hole through their center mass for a rope or a chain or a string of some kind, as you can actually see in this image on the screen from the Kofun examples. Now, if this line of thinking is correct, that the Magatama were worn as amulets for protection, then their presence at burial sites could indicate a belief in an afterlife of some sort, in which the buried might benefit from the presence of the Magatama. In the subsequent Kofun period, burial practices surrounding the Magatama apparently solidified. Magatama made of jade are ubiquitous in Kofun burial mounds. In fact, in almost every one of the earthen mounds from the Kofun era, we find these Magatama jewels. And this shift in their presence may indicate a transition between the Yayoi and the Kofun eras, from the Magatama being perhaps more decorative or a symbol of status to that of a particularly sacred object, again, perhaps one useful in the afterlife. My own sense is that these jewels were used for protection both during normal life and then also in the afterlife. But what this belief in the afterlife might have involved, I have no idea. But if it is true that these strange jewels were worn for protection in the land of the living, then our next question might be as to what the Yayoi or Kofun people, or even the older Jomon people with their Stone Age Magatama, what was it that they were seeking protection from? It's here that we might reintroduce the term kami mentioned earlier. This very famous term, again, a word often translated as deities or spirits or gods, or sometimes even as God in the singular, especially in a Japanese Christian context. In what we call Shinto today, Magatama are closely associated with kami. So it's not unreasonable to assume or speculate that kami were associated with Magatama in these most ancient periods as well. But knowing that we have barely any information about this association, we have to ask, what can we possibly say about ancient views of kami? How might these views have developed, perhaps prior to or in conjunction with the use of Magatama? This is a very difficult question, but some Japanese scholars have attempted to get a sense of what the ancient Japanese might have thought about kami by looking at proximate Southeast Asian phenomena in Thailand and Laos. Um, for example, Shinto scholar Ito Mikiharu and ethnologist Iwata Keiji, they studied phenomena in Thailand and Laos which described something called P or PHI. And I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. There is mentioned in Southeast Asian traditions a P of humans. There is a P of animals, a P of rivers and trees and rocks. There is also good P and there is negative P. Interestingly, both human beings and rice have a specific name for their type of pea called quan. Now, it seems it's not too difficult to imagine how it is that the pea of humans and the pea of rice could have become associated or identified. This pea or quan seems to be related to a kind of life force, a kind of spiritual force or essence. And rice may have become associated with this life giving power being primary in the diet of these cultures. Southeast Asian cultures evidently thought that this life giving power, this quan that was in the rice, could come and go. If a rice harvest failed to materialize, it might be thought that its quan had left the rice, perhaps prematurely. So I suggest that ideas like this may have paved the way for even recognizing agency in this life giving energy. If this energy can come and go out of various objects like rice. And perhaps this was a move made even easier by this energy's association with human agents. And possibly there were pre existing beliefs in other personal spiritual entities that could have mixed with these notions if they weren't even originally responsible for them. The fact is that to this day, many Laotians, even though they are deeply embedded in Theravada Buddhism, they continue to believe in spirits and personal agents, which they call P. And Quan are actually understood to be specifically 32 different P, which reside inside the human body. But I ultimately do need to emphasize that beliefs like this about spirits in Southeast Asian traditions, they've been extremely diverse. And while we may want to look closely at terms like P or Quan for help in understanding the Japanese term kami, this field seems to me to be just as difficult to sort out as the Japanese situation. And I'm by no means a scholar of Southeast Asia. But in my own personal speculations about Japan, I've nevertheless been interested in this idea of rice and its life force, which may be connected to the life force of human beings. The fact that spiritual entities might be described as departing from rice, or perhaps maybe even passing from rice into humans to nourish them. All of this seems suggestive to me of later Shinto concepts in which kami are passing in and out of objects or in and out of people. But again, describing any firm historical relationship between Southeast Asian ideas and Japanese ideas about kami, that's going to be rather speculative. But I will point out that one of the premier Western scholars of Shinto, Helen Hardacre, in her 2017 book, which I'll put up on the screen here, and this is a fantastic book, by the way, highly recommended. In Hardacre's description of the Yayoi period, she describes Japanese communities organized under hierarchical systems of chiefs. And she says that these chiefs conducted rituals dedicated to what she calls the spirits of rice. The chiefs, they would perform these rituals for the rice spirits either within their dwellings or in proximity to the rice storehouses where the grains and the seed was being stored for the upcoming year's crop. And Hardacre suggests that these ceremonies would ultimately closely associate these chiefs with the spirits of the rice. So perhaps beginning to form an idea of a priesthood. Now, going a bit further, and in the hopes of shedding more light on the mystery of Japanese religion during the Yayoi period, I want to also turn to an external, non Japanese historical source, one of our oldest records of Japan, a Chinese history called Records of the Three Kingdoms. This is a very important text for the history of China, much of which would become the basis for the later 14th century novel Sangguozhi Tongsi Yanyi, better known in the West as The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But this original Records of the Three Kingdoms contains an extensive footnote called Wei Liu, or the Records of Wei, which is said to have been written by a man named Yu Huan during the Wei period of the Three Kingdoms era, or roughly 220 to 280 CE. And this author, Yu Huan, while it seems that he never left China, he evidently collected various stories from travelers who had ventured to such distant locations as India and the Roman Empire. And this writing also contains information on Japan, which can cast some light, depending on its trustworthiness, on the religious situation during the Yayoi period. The text describes Japan as a country called Wa. It refers to a period of disturbance and warfare in Wa, which resulted in people gathering together and electing a female ruler named Pimiko, but more commonly known as Himiko with an H. Evidently, after Himiko was enthroned, she sent emissaries to the Chinese Emperor of Wei, who responded by giving her lavish gifts, including polished bronze mirrors, and he awarded her the title Queen of Wa, Himiko, Queen of Wa. And it is also said that Himiko's government would go on to encompass 22 chiefdoms. Evidently, that was thought to be rather robust or significant, although scholars have been unable to determine exactly where Himiko's center of power was located. But most importantly, for our purposes, the text says that Himiko occupied herself with magic and sorcery, and also that she was a medium or a conduit for communication with spirits. It describes her practice as something called Kido, which scholars have translated spirit way. Unfortunately, no further information is provided as to what this spirit way involved, leaving us to speculate. And by the way, on the screen, I've included a screen capture from the 1974 film called Himiko, directed by Shinoda Masahiro and starring Iwashida Shima, who is actually the director's wife. This is an interesting, artful movie, but I'm not at all endorsing its historical accuracy. In fact, it was never intending to be historically accurate. Nevertheless, it is interesting, mostly for Shinoda's filmmaking, and a famous movie that's at least worth mentioning. But getting back to Himiko and to her rituals, while the Records of the Three Kingdoms doesn't tell us very much, it does demonstrate that communion with spirits through a medium or a shaman might also be a feature of typical Yayoi religion. And clearly, this practice of inviting a kami into people to deliver messages, this would certainly characterize later developments in what can arguably be called Shinto. Now, also worth mentioning is another section of this text from the Record of the Three Kingdoms written by Yu Huan, which describes activities of chieftains in the Korean peninsula during the same period of Himiko's government. These Korean chieftains evidently performed spiritual rites which were related to the planting of crops. And also, it describes communication between humans and personal spirits. Excuse me. Other scholars have looked at Yayoi ritual sites and also at the proximity of Yayoi rituals to locations or objects of agricultural significance. So, all of this is suggestive of a Korean connection, which, if you know anything about the history of Japan, that's not surprising. But at the same time, I also can't help but be reminded of Southeast Asian beliefs about the spirits of rice. And if there are any scholars of Southeast Asia and its exchange with the Korean Peninsula, please feel free to comment below. I'd love to be further enlightened on this point. But in Japan, it has been suggested that certain ritual boundaries may have been drawn by the Japanese at these ritual sites around particular objects like trees or large stones or bodies of water, and that spiritual forces, kami, were invited to dwell in these places and within these things, and that somehow this would yield some sort of agricultural blessing. Helen Hardacre believes that at this time, these forces that were being invited to dwell in these objects, these weren't yet anthropomorphized. They weren't yet persons or human-like personalities. Rather, they were more amorphous or vague, invisible forces. But again, I want to point out that all of this is mostly drawn from inferences based on archaeological sites. We have no written documents helping us to pin down what the most ancient conceptions of kami in Japan actually were. We do need to keep this in mind, that our primary sources for ancient Japanese conceptions about kami are texts like the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, which were compiled from earlier sources, but compiled in the early 8th century. That's the early 8th century CE, meaning that these sources are rather late documents relative to the archaeological data that we're hoping they would shed some light on. And in the end, they end up being very dim lights indeed for understanding the specific beliefs and practices relative to kami in the earlier periods, since the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki were written long after China and Korea had transmitted traditions like Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism into the country. And therefore, it's very hard to tease these various streams of tradition apart. Nevertheless, since what we call Shinto today is sometimes reduced to the belief in kami or the veneration of kami, and since the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are perhaps the earliest and most authoritative sources for information about Japanese conceptions of kami, these texts are going to remain the best, perhaps most viable point of departure in our quest for the earliest form of Shinto. But we're going to have to we're going to have to save this further exploration of kami and of the kami in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki for another episode. For now, I want to take us into the last leg of this episode by returning to a question that I asked in my earlier video about Shinto's allegedly ancient origins. I want to ask a question about whether or not what we know as Shinto today can be located in ancient Japanese history. In the year 702, the Imperial Japanese government instituted the Taiho Code based on Confucianism-inspired laws from the Chinese Tang Dynasty. Chapter 6 of this code, known as the Jingiryo, or the Laws of the Deities, created a system linking various spiritual centers of worship or kami worship beneath a set of laws. The Jingikan was a government office instituted to maintain this system. And while some scholars have looked to the early modern period, or perhaps to the 15th century for Shinto's origins, some scholars have understandably looked to this early 8th century government unification of shrines and rituals and kami worship. But it is true that the term Shinto was not commonly used for the worship of kami at this time. Rather, the preferred term was Jingi. So, where do we first encounter or where do we find the first extant uses of the term Shinto in Japanese records? As I discussed in another episode, this word Shinto had a previous life in China as the term Shen Dao, likely used as a way of describing a loose collection of Chinese folk beliefs and practices rather than a specific Chinese religion. The word Shinto is not mentioned in the Japanese Kojiki text from 712, but it does appear 4 times in the Nihon Shoki from 720. These are the earliest appearances in Japan that we have in our possession, and I find the form of its appearance in this Nihon Shoki text to be very revealing indeed. The first time it's used in the Nihon Shoki is in a discussion about Buddhism. And here it is used to describe a way of kami as something distinguishable from the Dharma or from the teachings of the Buddha. And in the next occurrence in the Nihon Shoki, we also find a discussion of someone's allegiance to Buddhism. And again, excuse me, an explicit distinction being made between the teachings of the Buddha and the way of the kami, as if one might adhere to the one or the other. Very interesting. And the last two, I said there were four. The last two occurrences in the Nihon Shoki are interpolations, so we'll just set those aside. But ultimately, what we learn from the Nihon Shoki occurrences is that Shinto, during the period of the Japanese government's unification and formalization of kami worship, Shinto was not the preferred term, but it was nevertheless a term that was being used to describe a religious tradition that to some degree was distinguishable from Buddhism. Now, it is true, as scholar Mark Taven and Inoue Hiroshi have demonstrated, that the epochal figure Yoshida Kanetomo would later in the medieval period promote the term Shinto at the national level, probably pronounced Jindo at that time in the 15th century. And Yoshida's movement cemented the place of this term in Japanese history. And I will probably do a whole another video on Yoshida at some point. He is fascinating, and I was even thrilled to be able to visit his gravesite in Kyoto recently. However, my point of bringing all this up is this: if we consider the underlying ritual conceptual content, which Yoshida clearly elaborated upon, then we might recognize something of a persistent core of shrine-based veneration of kami that is clearly older than Yoshida's movement, something like the system overseen by the government's Jingikan office in the 8th century. Yes, prior to Yoshida's work in the 15th century, it is quite challenging to speak of Shinto as we think of it today. Nevertheless, as some scholars have argued, during the formation of the Jingikan office, we can observe not merely a skeletal outline, but perhaps the basic ingredients of popular conceptions of Shinto today. For example, a network of shrines, personnel who are operating the shrines and participating in the government, the presence of the Norito or the ritual prayers and liturgy, a ritual calendar. And while this shrine based system from the 8th century was not called Shinto, it just may be that a rose by any other name is still a rose. But I'm still wondering if we can say that Shinto stretches back any earlier than this. Can we identify Shinto among the rituals, sites, and artifacts of the Kofun period, or even the earlier Yayoi or the late Jomon periods? Inoue Nobutaka once said that it is impossible to describe a religious system as Shinto before the systemization of kami worship during the 8th century because he says it's all too ill defined. I'm paraphrasing here. And so, as I mentioned in our first episode about the question of Shinto's allegedly ancient origins, I think that what you think about the origins of Shinto is going to depend on how you think about the developments of religions in history. One might recognize just enough of modern Shinto in the relatively simple and disorganized or ill-defined system of shrines and rituals dedicated to the placation of spirits in the late Jomon or Yayoi periods. But for others, the differences between what we know of religion in ancient times and what would later be called Shinto may simply be too great to ignore. Again, at this stage, I'm not necessarily asking you to think of the development or persistence of religions through time in one way or the other. However, regardless of where one arrives on this spectrum, it is clear to me that what we call Shinto now, whatever it may once have been, is now identifiable as a, let's say, specific religion. but talk of Shinto's complete independence from Buddhism. That is, its independence throughout history as a distinct religion that is not Buddhism. This kind of discussion may ultimately be misleading, especially in a context like Japan, where it has been said that Shinto forms the roots of the Japanese tree, that Confucianism is its trunk and its branches, and that Buddhism is its blossoming flower. In future episodes, I'm going to continue our exploration of Shinto and of Japanese religiosity and of concepts like syncretism. And I'll ultimately be exploring the relationship between what we call Shinto and so called Western ways of doing religion. Specifically, in our next episode, I'm going to focus on one vital subject, which is very often considered something which decisively separates Shinto or Japanese ways of doing religion from purportedly Western traditions like Christianity. And that's the subject of kami, or deities, gods, or spirits. But until then, thanks so much for listening. I'm Dr. Kegan Chandler, and I hope to see you on our next episode where we will continue to explore Shinto. Thanks so much. Bye bye.